Imagine waking up on an early weekday morning. The sky is still dim, and your alarm rings steadily, just like every other day. You stretch, make yourself a hot cup of coffee, open your medicine cabinet, and freeze. The heart medication you've been taking for the past 5 years now costs twice as much.
hmm
Everything else is the same. The name on the box, the packaging, your usual pharmacy. But the number on the receipt is suddenly unfamiliar. You try to make sense of it, maybe a supply shortage, rising raw material costs, a local price hike. But then you see the morning news. A new executive order has just been signed in Washington, and just one line is enough to send shockwaves through the entire pharmaceutical world. 250%, the new import tax on foreign-made drugs. Not luxury goods, not wine or diamonds, but medicine. The bare minimum for sustaining life, for battling illness, for treating pain, no one asks for. A pill now suddenly turned into a luxury item just because it was made in India, Ireland, or China. And the reason? Because Donald Trump believes America must become self-reliant. But this isn't just America's story. It's a warning echoing across the globe that the world has entered a new era, one where tariffs are no longer financial tools, but ammunition in complex geopolitical battles. And this time, the battlefield isn't cars, semiconductors, or even steel and aluminum. It's shifting into the human body. Each pill, each box of antibiotics, each vial of insulin, now pawns in the power plays of global superpowers. A new age where everything, from a cheap online order to an elderly person's prescription, can be sacrificed with the stroke of a pen. And the one holding that pen is none other than Donald Trump, the man turning trade wars into a symbol of a stronger, yet far more precarious America. This isn't just about one executive order, it's a series of moves. Dozens of letters sent to pharmaceutical CEOs, tough rhetoric about Made in America, and thinly veiled threats: comply or face the penalty of tariffs. Trump isn't subtle. He doesn't hide his intentions. To him, this is how you force the world to change or make it pay the price. But when medicine becomes the target, that price is no longer just numbers on paper. It's pain without relief. It's treatments delayed. It's patients waiting day by day simply because supply chains have been cut off. And from this moment on, the world must ask itself, is this strategy the beginning of a truly independent America, or a political gamble holding public health hostage? The answer begins with a number: 250%. A number never before seen in modern pharmaceutical trade, a shockwave that stunned the entire global industry, and the opening salvo in a new chapter of the global economic war. A chapter where medicine is the very first bullet fired. 250%. A number that sent shockwaves through the global pharmaceutical industry. It doesn't just surpass every existing tariff precedent, it flies in the face of all the core principles that have long governed international medical trade. Under WTO agreements, pharmaceuticals have always been treated as a special category because they're directly tied to human life. For decades, even in the midst of bitter trade wars, nations maintained an unspoken consensus that medicine is a tariff-free zone where humanity takes precedence over power. But now, it's the United States, the very nation that once championed those agreements, that's the first to cross the line. Donald Trump doesn't deny it. On the contrary, he proudly declares that the pharmaceutical industry has become far too dependent on global supply chains. He points fingers at China, at India, at Ireland, countries that produce the bulk of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, and cheap generic drugs. What happens if one day they shut us off? Trump asked during a campaign rally amid roaring applause. And rather than wait for that day to come, he chose to trigger the disruption himself, arguing that only by being pushed to the brink would the pharmaceutical industry finally return to manufacturing on American soil. To Trump, this is a strategy for recovery. To drug companies, it's a threat. And to the American people, especially the middle class and the elderly, it's a blow they never saw coming. Because the drugs affected first are the most common, most essential, and hardest to replace. Medications for heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure. Hospitals are sounding the alarm. Health insurance providers warn of budget shortfalls. And pharmacy chains, who rely on imports to keep prices down, now face a grim choice: raise prices or let shelves go empty. One veteran pharmaceutical executive in New Jersey admitted, "We never prepared for a scenario like this. 250% is unthinkable. It will shred the entire logistics model as we know it. But the truth is, Trump doesn't need their agreement. He only needs their submission. And to achieve that, he's willing to play hardball, taxing imports to the point of making them economically meaningless. Of course, some exceptions are being discussed: cancer treatments, HIV medications, vaccines, and so on, but most of those exist only on paper. The exemption rules are tangled in strict conditions, bureaucratic hurdles, and, perhaps most dangerously, a cloud of legal uncertainty. Because the policy can change at any moment, with a single tweet or a brief press conference from the White House. And here's the thing, this isn't the end. Because if 250% on pharmaceuticals can be passed, then observers know no product is untouchable. And they were right. Just days later, Trump signed new tariff hikes on copper, semiconductors, and a slew of other industrial materials. A long list of trade partners were named, one after another, like suspects in a global economic crime scene, which means the pharmaceutical industry is not alone. And this isn't just about China anymore, like it was in Trump's previous term. This is a global war, because behind those pills are barrels of oil, coils of copper wire, computer chips, and longtime allies now being pulled into the eye of the storm. From India, the pharmaceutical powerhouse of the world, to Canada, America's closest neighbor. No one is exempt. No one stands outside this. And what began with a single pill has now become the opening signal of an unprecedented tariff crackdown in the history of modern economics. Not long after the pharmaceutical industry was hit with the 250% tariff, the world began to understand. This was no longer an isolated trade war. It was a full-scale global campaign, deliberate, coordinated, and utterly uncompromising. America First was no longer just a campaign slogan. It had become a loyalty test, measured in blunt force tariffs issued without warning, without negotiation. India was among the first to be struck. A country hailed as the pharmacy of the world, producing up to 60% of global generic medicines, was not spared. A 50% tariff was slapped on many imports from New Delhi. Not for economic reasons, but for something else entirely. India had bought oil from Russia. In Donald Trump's eyes, that was funding war, a decision that clashed with US interests. And so a punitive tariff was deployed. No subtlety, no diplomacy. Indian officials reacted sharply, calling it a case of political punishment in disguise. But Washington didn't flinch. Trump even declared publicly, if they buy Russian oil, then they should be ready to pay the price. In the language of global trade, there had never been a statement so blunt, especially aimed at the world's second most populous nation, once considered a strategic partner. Even Canada, a longtime ally under NAFTA, a neighbor that stood shoulder to shoulder with America throughout the 20th century, wasn't spared. This time, it wasn't about oil or semiconductors. It was about drugs and disrespect. Trump accused Canada of failing to stop the flow of illegal narcotics across the northern border and of anti-American trade behavior for retaliatory tariffs at a sensitive moment. His response? Raising tariffs to 35% on aluminum, construction lumber, and key Canadian agricultural products. That's when the world began to realize a terrifying truth. There were no limits to Trump's new tariff doctrine. No safe zones, no exceptions for friendship, no privileges for allies. Every country, every industry, every foreign policy decision could become a target. Tariffs were no longer about balancing trade. They were about controlling behavior, and it tilted the global landscape on its axis. Nations were forced to rethink everything. If even close friends weren't exempt, what was left to rely on? Uncertainty began to spread, not just in government offices, but in trading floors, production schedules, and the boardrooms of companies long accustomed to stable commerce. But here's the twist. Not everyone chose to fight back. Not every nation retaliated. While some governments reacted fiercely with lawsuits, sanctions, countermeasures, others chose a softer path. Concession, bargaining, backdoor diplomacy to avoid getting caught in the tariff storm. Among them, two names stood out. The European Union, representing major economies trying to secure their place on Trump's chessboard, and South Korea, a small but savvy player, opting to minimize damage by staying strategically silent. This was where the tariff war shifted from strikes to negotiations, a high-stakes game where every promise, every investment figure, every clause was weighed down to the millimeter. Because with a single nod, a tariff could drop from 30% to 15%. But with one moment of hesitation, an entire national supply chain could be at stake. And from that, a new kind of trade order began to emerge. No longer built on multilateral agreements, but on fragmented, tense, short-term deals. Deals where Trump played the role of gatekeeper, selling access to the American market. And the world, willing or not, had no choice but to buy. If tariffs are a form of warfare, then some nations have chosen to take up arms. But others have taken a different path, not one of confrontation, but of negotiation. Not with loud resistance, but with quiet, calculated retreat, just enough to avoid being crushed. In the wave of tariffs unleashed by Donald Trump, the European Union and South Korea stand as the clearest examples of the less pain now to avoid more later strategy. And in that difference of approach, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. This isn't just about economics. It's a strategic test of resilience, negotiation skill, and patience. For Europe, it all began with a threat. If you don't give in, tariffs on cars, medicine, and medical equipment could reach 30%. In a time when the global economy remains fragile, that number could send entire industries into crisis. But then just 3 weeks of tense behind-the-scenes talks later, the EU and the US unexpectedly announced a preliminary agreement. Tariffs would be lowered to 15% in exchange for a $600 billion investment commitment into US infrastructure projects, along with perks for accessing clean tech sectors. On paper, it was a win-win. But beneath the polished surface, many experts raised questions. Would that money actually be delivered? Or was it just a political promise, enough to make Trump sheath the tariff blade, but with no concrete strings attached? Similarly, South Korea chose the path of quiet endurance. As a nation heavily reliant on exports, especially semiconductors, automobiles, and display panels, Seoul understood the cost of American tariffs all too well. When the 15% tariff order was announced, South Korea didn't lash out. It didn't file complaints at the WTO. Instead, it quietly entered negotiations, trying to maintain the status quo in critical sectors in exchange for accepting short-term losses in less essential areas. Amid an unstable geopolitical climate, that decision allowed South Korea to retain access to the US market while shielding its strategic industries from supply chain collapse. But it's exactly these bilateral deals that are quietly sowing the seeds of a deeper crisis. The slow unraveling of the global multilateral trade system. When the WTO is pushed to the sidelines, when shared rules are no longer respected, the world slips into a new kind of order. One where the rules are written by the strong and the weak are left to bargain for survival. Each country must fend for itself. Each agreement is a transaction, and every successful deal sets a new precedent. One that says the rules can be changed at any moment as long as someone has the power to name their price. In this world, Trump doesn't need to win everywhere. He just needs to instill enough fear. And once that fear creeps into government war rooms, global boardrooms, and shareholder meetings, his trade war is already halfway won. But Trump didn't stop there. After targeting pharmaceuticals, traditional goods, and forcing bilateral concessions, he began to aim at the two most critical pillars of the 21st century economy: semiconductors, the heart of all technology, and copper, the lifeblood of global industry. Two seemingly unrelated sectors, but both now caught in a simultaneous clampdown, a double blow that is as calculated as it is dangerous, and one that could reshape global supply chains for years to come. And if the earlier strikes only made the world anxious, this one is the moment economies begin preparing for the worst. Donald Trump didn't stop at pharmaceuticals or automobiles. He escalated the tariff war to a whole new level by targeting two of the most essential pillars of global industry: semiconductors and copper. One is the brain behind every modern device, from smartphones to satellites, from electric cars to smart weapons. The other, seemingly humble, is the indispensable conductor in every electrical system, every building, every machine that powers modern civilization. When both are squeezed at once, the world doesn't just worry anymore. It begins to panic. A 50% tariff was imposed on semi-processed copper imports, directly impacting manufacturers of electrical wiring, household appliances, and even the infrastructure sector, which is racing to rebuild across the US after a wave of natural disasters. Trump's stated goal wasn't new: to protect domestic metallurgy and reduce dependence on imported copper from Chile, Peru, and China. But the way he did it, suddenly, without warning, and with extreme severity, sent shockwaves through the industry. Within just a week, copper prices on commodity exchanges surged, export contracts were canceled, and U.S. electrical manufacturers raised the alarm in unison. Costs were spiraling out of control. At the same time, a leaked draft from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, revealed plans for new tariffs on imported semiconductors, especially from Asia, which supplies over 70% of the world's chips. The semiconductor sector had already been rocked by COVID-19, the Russia-Ukraine war, and U.S. sanctions against China. Now it faces yet another blow. Tariffs ranging from 20 to 40% depending on chip type and origin. This means American tech giants, from Apple to Tesla, from Intel to Boeing, will face steeper costs for every component, every upgrade. And in the end, it's the consumer who will carry the burden. The US government justified the move with a familiar argument. It's time for chip manufacturing to return home. After spending hundreds of billions in an era where a single smartphone contains more than 1,600 components sourced from around the world, one executive order from the White House can unravel the entire system of cross-border cooperation. Anxiety spreads, from boardrooms of multinational giants to chip fabs in Asia to stock exchanges in Frankfurt and Tokyo. Everyone's revising their forecasts, because no one knows anymore what will Trump tax next. And amid that chaos, a new wave begins to rise, a wave of legal resistance, because not everyone chooses silence. When tariffs become absurd, when the economic damage exceeds the breaking point, businesses and nations begin to push back, not with threats or slogans, but with lawsuits, with statutes, with justice. And for the first time in years, the United States, despite all its power, is facing something it has never seen before, a collective lawsuit against its own tariff policies. The hastily signed executive orders from the Oval Office didn't just rattle supply chains or send prices soaring. They also pulled the legal system, both domestic and international, into a battle with no precedent. This time, America is no longer just the plaintiff as it often was in the past. It is now the defendant against itself in a wave of lawsuits stretching from federal courts to the halls of the World Trade Organization in Geneva. In the US, the backlash is no longer confined to op-eds or TV interviews. It's entered the courtroom. Dozens of small businesses, particularly retail pharmacy chains, electronic component importers, and even Native American tribes have filed lawsuits against the federal government. Their argument: President Trump exceeded his constitutional authority by unilaterally imposing tariffs without congressional approval. Some lower courts have already issued temporary injunctions against select tariff measures. Others are gearing up for long legal battles that may eventually reach the Supreme Court. But the legal fight isn't stopping at America's borders. Internationally, Trump's tariff policy is triggering an unprecedented wave of legal retaliation. Canada was the first country to formally bring a case to the World Trade Organization, WTO, claiming that the 35% tariffs imposed by Washington violate the commitments laid out in the updated North American Trade Agreement, USMCA. Ottawa didn't shout, but it moved decisively, filing full documentation, compiling strong legal evidence, and launching a quiet diplomatic campaign to rally support from European allies. The European Union, despite having temporarily struck a tariff-free deal, isn't staying silent either. Several EU member states, led by Germany and France, have begun discussing the possibility of suing the US if investment promises aren't fulfilled. Even Switzerland, long known for its neutrality, has signaled it may pursue legal action if tariffs on copper and pharmaceuticals are extended indefinitely. Every lawsuit is more than a legal challenge. It's a warning bell, not just for the Trump administration, but for the entire global trade system. Because if the United States, the country that helped write the very rules of the WTO, now stands accused of breaking them, what's left for smaller nations to believe in? But perhaps the biggest consequence won't be in court. It will be in the way nations begin to see themselves. As America pivots toward protectionism, throws up trade barriers, and ignores the rules it once upheld, other countries are choosing a different path. Not filing lawsuits just to reduce tariffs, but rebuilding their systems so they'll never have to ask again. And that's when a new wave begins to rise, quiet but powerful, from Asia to Europe, from Latin America to Africa, a wave of economic self-reliance. Gone is the blind trust in the US market. Gone is the hope for sweeping protective trade deals. Now, nations are investing in domestic supply chains, ramping up strategic production, pouring resources into core technologies and industrial infrastructure. This isn't revenge, it's an awakening. Because if trade can be weaponized, if trust can be erased with a single signature, then economic independence is no longer a luxury. It's a necessity for survival. And so amid legal chaos, tense negotiations, and growing conflict, the world is quietly stepping into a new era. One where countries no longer settle for playing backup, no longer serve only as markets to consume, but choose to start over on their own terms. There's no need for loud declarations, no need for tit-for-tat theatrics in the media. Quietly, steadily, many nations have begun to act, not to confront the United States, but to escape dependency on it. A new wave is rising, not an anti-American movement, but a movement to stand tall on one's own feet. And it has a name: self-reliance. In India, after the shock of a 50% tariff for buying Russian oil, the government in New Delhi didn't back down with apologies or make noise through international lawsuits. Instead, it sped up. Emergency funding was issued for domestic pharmaceutical industrial zones. Production of active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, was ramped up. A new version of the Make in India policy was rolled out, focused on healthcare, technology, and defense. Everything that once depended on imports, from antibiotics to diagnostic equipment, is now being gradually localized. And most importantly, India isn't doing this because of America. They're doing it for themselves, for a future where no foreign tariff can dictate their fate. Across the globe, Canada, long known for its measured tone, is also beginning to speak differently. After being hit with tariffs on lumber, agricultural goods, and pharmaceuticals, Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed Parliament with words rarely heard in Canadian politics. Open quote, "We must stop wagering our economic future on fragile deals with global powers. It's time to invest in Canadians, in Canadian factories, in what belongs to us." Close quote. From that moment, a wave of domestic stimulus followed, supporting everything from vaccine manufacturing to closed-loop agricultural supply chains. Local companies received tax breaks and government procurement preferences. And perhaps most telling of all, Canadian consumers began quietly boycotting American goods. Not through protests, not through slogans, but through daily choices at supermarkets and convenience stores. Europe too has joined this shift. After years of relying on the US as a pillar of security and a major export market, the European Union is now outlining its strategy for strategic autonomy, with more clarity than ever before. New trade policies are being drafted with a central assumption, open quote, "Cooperation with the US can break at any time." Close quote. Supply chains for semiconductors, lithium batteries, rare earth elements, and medical equipment are all being reoriented toward internal EU production. Germany is pouring investment into nanotechnology. France is funding next-generation vaccine labs. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark are racing to expand port capacity, so they no longer have to rely on transatlantic logistics. Each country, one small step at a time. But together, they signal a geopolitical shift. Because behind every act of self-reliance lies a clear message. The world no longer wants to be controlled, no longer wants to overhaul its systems every time the US changes presidents, no longer wants global stock markets to crumble from a single Washington tweet, no longer wants the price of medicine, energy, or food to be dictated by a campaign strategy half a world away. Self-reliance may not immediately shake America's position, but it is quietly building a new world, a world where power no longer belongs solely to the strong, but to those who know how to rise after the storm. A world that is more multipolar, more balanced, and far more cautious of dazzling promises that change with the wind. Perhaps never before in modern history has the world witnessed such a rapid shift in the global trade order. What was once considered foundational, free trade, policy stability, multilateral commitments, is now up for debate. One tariff can alter the fate of an entire industry. One signature from the White House can rattle the economies of dozens of countries. And one man, Donald Trump, is redefining how the world understands trade. No longer a win-win collaboration, but a ruthless negotiation where those without power are forced to yield. We now stand at a crossroads in history. One path leads to self-reliance, with nations investing more in their own strength, in local supply chains, in independence across technology, healthcare, and energy. A path that is long, difficult, but sustainable. The other, a descent into trade chaos, where tariffs become weapons, legal battles and economic punishments become the norm, and trust between nations erodes day by day under the weight of short-term power games. The question is no longer who's right or wrong, it's how much are we willing to sacrifice to protect our future? And will an America surrounded by tariffs truly be stronger? Or simply a superpower building walls that isolate it from the rest of the world? For everyday people, these shifts don't happen in summits or press briefings. They show up in the price of a bottle of medicine, in the cost of a morning coffee, in the devices we once took for granted, now increasingly out of reach. We're living in a time where decisions made behind closed doors can reach all the way to the dinner table, the doctor's office, the job market, and that's why we can't afford to stay uninvolved. If today's video helped you see more clearly what lies behind the headlines and economic jargon, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts about self-reliance, about the value of economic independence, or simply about that one moment when you realized the world was changing, right there on a store shelf. And if you'd like to keep following these deep dives into the politics, economics, and trade forces reshaping our world, subscribe to the channel. Because knowledge isn't just power, it's how we protect ourselves in a world that never stops shifting. See you in the next video, where we'll continue to unravel the quiet, but no less dangerous storms shaping our future.